Kill the story. The voice on the secured line is perfectly calm, stripped of any emotion. Kill the story, scrub the reporter's credentials, and run the alternate copy on the front page tomorrow. A heavy click echoes through the receiver, followed by the low hum of a dead connection. A man sits in a dimly lit, oak-paneled office overlooking the Potomac River, holding a disconnected red telephone. With a single, hushed conversation, he has just erased a geopolitical truth from existence, and replaced it with a manufactured reality. He isn't a dictator. He isn't a general. He is an American intelligence officer, and the printing presses that will churn out his lie tomorrow morning belong to the most respected, independent newspapers in the free world. The reality you perceive, the news you consume, the evening broadcasts that play in your living room, they are a perfectly constructed, heavily funded illusion designed to make you dance to a tune you cannot even hear. We are going to dive deep into this machinery of manipulation. I will take you from the surface level of the history you were taught, down to the absolute darkest depths of psychological warfare and covert influence. We will examine the architecture of a machine explicitly designed to control the very fabric of human perception. Welcome to the investigation of Operation Mockingbird. To understand how a free press transforms into an instrument of absolute state control, we must trace the wires back to the source. The ashes of the Second World War are still smoldering. The National Security Act of 1947 has just birthed the Central Intelligence Agency. On paper, it is a defensive organization tasked with gathering information to protect the United States from foreign threats. But the men in charge of this new intelligence apparatus, figures like Alan Dulles and Frank Wisner, possess a much more aggressive, terrifying vision. They see a looming, existential shadow in the Soviet Union. They understand that the impending Cold War will not be a conventional clash of armies and artillery, it will be a profound clash of ideologies. Furthermore, they understand a fundamental truth about human psychology. Wars are not ultimately won on physical battlefields. They are won within the mind. If you control the information a population consumes, you inherently control their reality. You dictate their fears, you shape their allegiances, and you subtly direct their actions without them ever realizing they are being led. Enter Frank Wisner, a man who intuitively grasped the mechanics of profound psychological influence. In 1948, Wisner was appointed as the director of the Office of Special Projects, an entity rapidly renamed the Office of Policy Coordination. This was the newly minted covert action wing of the CIA. Wisner's mandate was deliberately broad and unprecedented. He was officially authorized to engage in covert propaganda, economic warfare, sabotage, and subversion against hostile states. But Wisner's most devastating creation was not a physical weapon. It was an invisible, sprawling network. He lovingly referred to it as his mighty Wurlitzer. A Wurlitzer is a massive, complex theater organ capable of producing a vast, staggering array of sounds, essentially mimicking an entire orchestra from a single, centralized keyboard. Wisner envisioned a global network of journalists, editors, publishers, and media executives that he could manipulate just like that organ. With a single keystroke in Washington, he intended to dictate the tune played by newspapers and radio stations across the entire world. Consider the sheer psychological brilliance of this strategy. When a government directly broadcasts a message to its citizens, those citizens naturally raise their cognitive defenses. They evaluate the source, they question the underlying motives, and they apply a healthy degree of skepticism. This is human nature. However, if those same citizens read the exact same manufactured information in their favorite, trusted newspaper, written by a respected journalist whose byline they have followed for years, those psychological defenses are completely bypassed. The information slips past their critical faculties and embeds itself directly into the foundation of their worldview. It ceases to be propaganda and immediately becomes their truth. Wisner understood this vulnerability perfectly. He knew that the most effective, most dangerous propaganda is the kind that disguises itself as independent, objective journalism. So, how does an intelligence agency construct a mighty Wurlitzer? You do not begin at the bottom. You do not try to recruit lowly cub reporters. You start at the absolute apex of the media hierarchy. The CIA systematically and quietly approached the owners and publishers of the most powerful, influential media empires in America. They initiated contact with Philip Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. They sat down with Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times. They cultivated a relationship with Henry Luce, the incredibly powerful founder of Time and Life magazines. And crucially, they did not approach these titans with crude threats or financial bribes. Instead, they utilized a far more potent psychological lever. They leveraged patriotism, and they offered the intoxicating allure of the inner circle. Imagine the psychological position of a major newspaper publisher in the early 1950s. The geopolitical climate is incredibly tense. The threat of nuclear annihilation is a daily, suffocating reality. Suddenly, a high-ranking intelligence officer invites you to a private, off-the-record dinner at an exclusive Washington club. He speaks in hushed, serious tones. He explicitly tells you that your country needs your help. He shares highly classified information, effectively bringing you into a secret brotherhood of men who believe they are actively shaping the fate of the free world. He does not ask you to outright lie to your readership. He simply asks for a degree of cooperation. A little patriotic discretion. Perhaps you could subtly amplify this specific narrative about a foreign leader. Perhaps you could quietly kill another story that might unnecessarily embarrass an intelligence asset. Perhaps you could provide official journalistic credentials as cover for an operative working in a hostile nation. For these powerful men, this psychological appeal was nearly impossible to resist. It heavily validated their immense sense of self-importance. It elevated them from mere observers of history to active, clandestine participants in making it. Consequently, the top tier of American journalism quietly, seamlessly merged with the nation's intelligence apparatus. The surface remained unchanged, but the roots were now deeply entwined with the CIA. Yet, securing the publishers was only the first step. To truly control the narrative, the operation needed to reach the individuals actually typing the words. We must now examine the psychological machinery used to recruit the reporters and columnists, the ground troops of the mighty Wurlitzer. You might ask yourself, why would a fiercely independent journalist, a professional supposedly dedicated to speaking truth to power, willingly become a mouthpiece for an intelligence agency? The answer lies in the CIA's masterful manipulation of human desire and professional ambition. The recruitment process was rarely a clumsy exchange of cash in a dark alley. It was a sophisticated, multi-tiered psychological grooming process. The first and most effective tool was access. In the highly competitive world of journalism, access is currency. The CIA essentially created a two-tiered system of information. Journalists who played along, who demonstrated a willingness to adopt the agency's preferred framing, were rewarded with exclusive scoops. They were granted interviews with high-ranking officials and given insider details that allowed them to break front-page stories. This artificially inflated their professional reputations, making them appear incredibly well-connected and insightful. Conversely, journalists who asked uncomfortable questions or demonstrated independent thought found themselves frozen out. Their calls went unreturned, their sources dried up, and their careers languished. It was a subtle but incredibly powerful behavioral conditioning system. The CIA was training the press corps like laboratory animals, rewarding compliance with career advancement and punishing defiance with professional starvation. But access was not the only psychological hook. The agency expertly exploited the deeply ingrained patriotism of the era. Many of these journalists had served in World War II. They viewed themselves as loyal Americans who had a duty to protect their country. CIA case officers would approach them under the guise of shared national defense. They would frame a request not as a manipulation of the public, but as a vital contribution to national security. "We need your help to counter Soviet disinformation," they would say. "By writing this piece, you are serving your country just as effectively as a soldier on the front lines." This reframing allowed the journalists to bypass their own ethical guidelines. They convinced themselves that they were not compromising their journalistic integrity, but rather answering a higher moral calling. This is a classic cognitive dissonance resolution. The mind rationalizes a betrayal of one's principles by elevating the perceived nobility of the cause. The scale of this recruitment was staggering. By the time the operation reached its peak, the CIA had essentially placed assets in every major news organization in the world. They had working relationships with reporters at the Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, Newsweek, and dozens of major metropolitan dailies. Some journalists were paid directly, receiving a regular stipend from the agency. Others were merely friendly, willing to accept planted stories or alter their coverage as a favor to their intelligence contacts. Furthermore, the CIA did not just manipulate existing journalists, they actively created their own. The agency secretly funded and established seemingly independent news services and magazines, completely controlling their editorial direction from inception. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and insidious aspects of Operation Mockingbird, the creation of cultural front organizations. The CIA understood that political propaganda is often obvious and easily dismissed. But cultural influence is subtle, pervasive, and deeply persuasive. If you can shape the art, the literature, and the intellectual discourse of a society, you can fundamentally alter its collective psychology. To this end, the CIA heavily funded the Congress for Cultural Freedom. This was a sprawling, international advocacy group that presented itself as a bastion of independent, anti-totalitarian thought. It sponsored conferences, funded art exhibitions, and most importantly, subsidized a vast network of prestigious literary and political magazines across Europe and the United States. Publications like Encounter in the UK, Der Monat in Germany, and the Partisan Review in the United States received covert CIA funding. The intellectuals and writers contributing to these magazines often had no idea they were indirectly on the CIA payroll. The agency did not necessarily dictate every word they wrote. Instead, they used a technique called negative control. They funded the platforms that naturally amplified the voices and ideologies that aligned with American interests, while ensuring that opposing viewpoints were quietly marginalized or ignored. They were not telling people what to think, they were subtly restricting the boundaries of what was considered acceptable thought. It was the ultimate form of psychological framing, operating on a societal scale. Let's look at how a planted story actually moves through this system. This is the anatomy of a psychological operation. The CIA's propaganda division would draft a story, perhaps a fabricated report about a Soviet atrocity, or a smear piece against a foreign leader who was resisting American corporate interests. This fabricated story is called black propaganda. They would then hand this story to one of their recruited journalists working for an international wire service like Reuters. The journalist would publish the story under a legitimate news banner. Now, the story has been laundered. It is no longer a CIA fabrication, it is a Reuters news report. Once the story hits the international wire, the second phase begins. American newspapers, entirely unaware of the story's true origin, would see the report on the wire and reprint it for their domestic audiences. This is the phenomenon known as blowback. The CIA was statutorily forbidden from operating within the United States or directly propagandizing the American public. But by planting stories in foreign media and allowing the natural mechanics of the international news cycle to pull those stories back into the domestic press, the agency successfully bypassed these legal restrictions. They infected the global information stream at the source, knowing the current would eventually carry the poison back home. This wasn't just a theoretical exercise. The consequences of this manipulated reality were deeply profound, altering the course of nations and resulting in immense human suffering. To truly understand the destructive power of this operation, we must look at how the mighty Wurlitzer was deployed to orchestrate the overthrow of sovereign governments. We are moving from the manipulation of words to the spilling of blood. Let us examine the practical application of this psychological weapon. We must travel to 1954, to the lush, volcanic landscapes of Guatemala. The nation had democratically elected a man named Jacobo Arbenz as its president. Arbenz was not a communist. He was a moderate nationalist who believed that the vast swathes of uncultivated land held by the American multinational United Fruit Company should be purchased by the government and redistributed to impoverished Guatemalan peasants. This was a direct threat to corporate profits, and by extension, in the eyes of the CIA, a threat to American hegemony in the hemisphere. The order was given to remove him. But a direct military invasion would be globally condemned. Instead, the CIA deployed the mighty Wurlitzer. This operation was code-named PB Success. Before a single shot was fired, a massive psychological artillery barrage was launched against both the Guatemalan people and the American public. The CIA understood that to justify a coup, they first had to create the terrifying illusion of a communist menace. They began by flying in their recruited journalists. These reporters were given guided tours by CIA handlers, fed carefully curated misinformation, and provided with fabricated documents purportedly showing deep ties between Arbenz and Moscow. Simultaneously, the CIA established a clandestine radio station just across the border in Honduras. They called it the Voice of Liberation. It was designed to sound like a grassroots, internal Guatemalan resistance movement. The broadcast was a masterclass in psychological terror. They broadcast false reports of massive rebel armies marching on the capital, fabricated stories of Arbenz's government mass executing dissidents, and constantly urged the Guatemalan military to defect. They even utilized sophisticated radio jamming techniques to silence the legitimate government broadcasts, leaving the CIA's manufactured nightmare as the only voice in the darkness. The psychological impact on the Guatemalan military and the civilian population was devastating. Paranoia swept through the capital. The constant barrage of manufactured fear paralyzed the government. The illusion of an overwhelming, unstoppable rebellion became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Arbenz, isolated and believing the situation was utterly hopeless, resigned and fled the country. A CIA-backed military dictatorship was installed, plunging Guatemala into decades of horrific civil war and genocide. And how was this presented to the American public? The journalists who had been cultivated by the CIA dutifully reported it as a glorious, popular uprising against a communist tyrant. The American people read their newspapers and believed their government had struck a righteous blow for freedom. They were completely blind to the fact that their perception had been engineered in a laboratory of psychological warfare. This same blueprint was utilized a year earlier in Iran. In 1953, the Iranian Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, made the fateful decision to nationalize his country's oil industry, wresting control away from the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Again, corporate interests were threatened. Again, the intelligence apparatus was mobilized. Operation Ajax was launched. In Iran, the CIA flooded the media with entirely fabricated articles portraying Mossadegh as a corrupt, communist-sympathizing madman. They bribed newspaper editors, funded anti-Mossadegh clerics to spread dissent in the mosques, and even hired street thugs to stage violent riots, which were then reported in the planted media as spontaneous outpourings of public rage against the Prime Minister. The psychological warfare in Iran was designed to fracture the society, creating an atmosphere of total chaos and instability that would justify military intervention. They weaponized the pre-existing tensions within Iranian society, exploiting religious and political divides to tear the country apart from the inside out. Once the manufactured chaos reached its boiling point, a CIA-orchestrated military coup overthrew Mossadegh and reinstalled the Shah, a brutal dictator who was entirely subservient to Western interests. And once again, the American public was fed a completely sanitized, heroic narrative of the events, crafted by the very men who had engineered the atrocity. What is vital to understand is the insidious nature of the blowback effect. When the CIA planted a story in an Iranian newspaper about Mossadegh being a communist, that story was picked up by the international wire services. It was then published in the New York Times and the Washington Post. American citizens, entirely unaware of the deception, read those stories and formed strong political opinions based on lies. They voted for politicians based on those lies. They supported foreign policies based on those lies. The CIA was not just manipulating the target populations in Guatemala and Iran, they were inadvertently, yet systematically, brainwashing the American electorate. The domestic public became the collateral damage in a global war for psychological dominance. This creates a terrifying philosophical loop. If the media, which is the primary sensory organ through which a democratic society perceives the world, is infected with intentional falsehoods, then the democratic process itself becomes a hollow pantomime. A society cannot govern itself rationally if its fundamental understanding of reality is being manipulated by a shadow organization operating with zero accountability. The mighty Wurlitzer was not merely an instrument of foreign policy, it was a slow-acting poison injected directly into the bloodstream of the American Republic. The illusion of an objective press was maintained, while the reality was entirely synthetic. The depth of this deception is difficult to fully comprehend. It is the realization that major historical events, the very building blocks of our collective memory, were not naturally occurring phenomena, but carefully scripted theatrical productions directed by intelligence officers. For over 20 years, this grand illusion held. The machinery operated in the dark, shaping the world to its own design. But no secret can be kept forever, especially one so vast and deeply intertwined with the institutions of public record. The unraveling began in the late 1960s. The political climate was shifting. The Vietnam War had shattered the unquestioning trust the public held in their government. A profound skepticism was taking root. The first major crack in the facade appeared not in the mainstream press, but in a small, radical Catholic magazine called Ramparts. In 1967, Ramparts published a meticulously researched expose detailing how the CIA had been secretly funding the National Student Association, using it as a front to recruit young, influential student leaders into the intelligence apparatus. This revelation was the loose thread that began to unravel the entire tapestry. It proved that the CIA was actively operating domestically, violating its charter and manipulating American civil society. The exposure sent shockwaves through the establishment, but the true reckoning was still years away. It was not until the post-Watergate era, a time of unprecedented congressional investigation into the executive branch, that the full terrifying scope of the operation was dragged into the light. In 1975, the United States Senate established the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, chaired by Senator Frank Church. The Church Committee hearings were a traumatic national event. For the first time, high-ranking intelligence officials were forced to testify publicly about assassinations, domestic spying, and the manipulation of the media. The existence of the mighty Wurlitzer was laid bare. William Colby, the director of Central Intelligence at the time, was forced to admit that the agency had relationships with hundreds of journalists and numerous media organizations. However, the most detailed and damning portrait of Operation Mockingbird did not come from the government itself. It came 2 years later, in 1977, from a journalist named Carl Bernstein. Bernstein was already a legend, having co-authored the Watergate investigation that brought down Richard Nixon. He spent months interviewing former CIA officials and media executives, piecing together the fractured history of the program. He published his findings in a massive, sprawling article in Rolling Stone magazine titled, "The CIA and the Media." Bernstein's article was a bombshell. He named names. He detailed how the publisher of the New York Times had provided cover for CIA agents. He exposed how Time magazine had allowed the agency to dictate coverage. He outlined the sheer scale of the operation, estimating that over 400 American journalists had secretly carried out assignments for the CIA. He exposed the financial ties, the psychological grooming, and the profound corruption of the journalistic ideal. The very institutions that had celebrated Bernstein for uncovering the Watergate conspiracy were now furious with him for exposing their own dark secrets. The establishment media largely ignored or attempted to discredit his report. The cognitive dissonance was too great. The mirror he held up to the industry was too horrifying to look at. In the wake of these revelations, the CIA found itself facing an existential crisis. The public outrage was palpable. In response, George H.W. Bush, who had recently been appointed Director of Central Intelligence, issued a newly formulated policy regarding the agency's relationship with the media. In a carefully worded statement, he announced that the CIA would no longer enter into paid or contractual relationships with any full-time or part-time news correspondent accredited by any United States news service, newspaper, periodical, radio, or television network or station. The agency promised that it would stop manipulating the American press. This was the official resolution. This is where the textbook history ends. But history is rarely that neat. The policy instituted by George H.W. Bush was just that, a policy. It was not a law. It was an internal agency guideline that could be modified or ignored at any time. Furthermore, the phrasing was incredibly specific. It applied only to accredited journalists working for American news organizations. It did nothing to stop the CIA from paying foreign journalists, which, as we have already established, inevitably results in blowback to the American public. It also did not prohibit journalists from voluntarily assisting the agency, maintaining the insidious relationships based on access and patriotism that had fueled the operation from the beginning. This brings us to the chilling reality of the present day. We are currently living in an era of unprecedented information density. The media landscape has fractured and multiplied exponentially. We no longer rely on 3 television networks and a handful of national newspapers. We are bombarded with information from countless digital platforms, social media networks, and independent creators. The very concept of an accredited journalist has become ambiguous. If the CIA found it necessary and entirely justifiable to construct a global propaganda machine in the 1950s, when the world was far simpler, what would prevent them from doing so today? We are not merely talking about planted newspaper articles anymore. We are talking about the era of cognitive security. We are facing sophisticated psychological operations conducted through algorithms, deepfakes, and targeted micro-advertising. Intelligence agencies across the globe, not just the CIA, possess tools of psychological manipulation that Frank Wisner could only have dreamed of. They can map the psychological profile of entire populations through data harvesting, identifying our deepest fears and insecurities, and then feeding us highly personalized, emotionally resonant narratives designed to provoke a specific reaction. The mighty Wurlitzer is no longer a centralized organ, it is a decentralized, digital nervous system that envelopes the entire globe. The legacy of Operation Mockingbird is not just a historical curiosity. It is a fundamental warning about the fragility of truth in a democratic society. It proves that the institutions we rely on to make sense of the world are exceptionally vulnerable to manipulation by those in power. It demonstrates that our perception of reality is not inherently objective, but is rather a construct that can be engineered, modified, and weaponized. When you look at the news today, when you scroll through your social media feeds, when you consume the narratives that shape your understanding of global events, you must ask yourself a terrifying question. Are you consuming organic, objective truth? Or are you simply hearing the subtle, complex melodies of a modern Wurlitzer, played by unseen hands in the dark? The ultimate psychological victory for any intelligence agency is not to force you to believe a lie. The ultimate victory is to manipulate your reality so profoundly that you believe the lie was your own original thought. You have descended into the depths of the Mockingbird. The investigation is closed, but the illusion remains. To fully appreciate the evolution of this psychological warfare, we must dive into the actual manuals, the theoretical framework that operators use to construct these illusions. The intelligence community classifies propaganda into 3 distinct categories, based entirely on the concealment of the source. Understanding these categories is essential to understanding how your reality is currently being shaped. The first category is white propaganda. This is the most straightforward. The source is clearly identified, and the information is generally accurate, though heavily curated to present a specific viewpoint. Think of an official press release from a government agency, or a broadcast from a state-sponsored media outlet like the Voice of America. It is overt influence. You know exactly who is speaking to you and what their agenda likely is. Your cognitive defenses are appropriately engaged. The second category is gray propaganda. This is where the ethical lines begin to blur violently. In gray propaganda, the true source of the information is hidden, and the accuracy of the information itself is questionable. It might be entirely true, partially true, or entirely false. The goal is not necessarily to convince the audience of a specific fact, but to inject a narrative into the public discourse without leaving fingerprints. The funding of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a massive gray propaganda operation. The CIA did not explicitly write the articles in those literary magazines, but by secretly funding the platforms, they ensured that pro-Western, anti-communist ideologies dominated the intellectual conversation. The audience believed they were reading the independent thoughts of prominent intellectuals, entirely unaware that the stage they were standing on was built with intelligence funds. The third and most dangerous category is black propaganda. This is the realm of complete deception. In black propaganda, the source is entirely fabricated, and the information is almost always a deliberate lie designed to cause maximum psychological damage. It is a psychological false flag operation. The broadcasts of the Voice of Liberation in Guatemala, designed to sound like a grassroots rebellion, were pure black propaganda. The fabricated stories planted in the Iranian press about Mossadegh were black propaganda. The goal is to induce panic, confusion, and visceral hatred. Black propaganda is the cognitive equivalent of a biological weapon. It is designed to infect the host society, replicate rapidly, and destroy the rational functioning of the target population. Operation Mockingbird was a masterclass in seamlessly blending gray and black propaganda into the daily media diet of the American people. And this brings us to the concept of manufactured consent, a theory heavily developed by political philosophers examining these exact mechanisms. Manufactured consent suggests that in a supposedly free and democratic society, the ruling class cannot control the population through overt physical force, as a totalitarian regime might. Instead, they must control the population by controlling what they think. They must manufacture the public's consent for policies that they otherwise would never support. Mockingbird was the engine of this manufacturing process. By controlling the parameters of the debate, the intelligence community ensured that the public could argue vehemently over the details, but never question the underlying premise. You could argue about how the Cold War was being fought, but you could never question the necessity of the Cold War itself. The media, compromised by its deep ties to the intelligence state, served to narrow the spectrum of acceptable opinion. Anything outside that narrow spectrum was deemed radical, unpatriotic, or simply insane. This is the ultimate form of psychological imprisonment. It is a prison where the inmates cannot even perceive the bars, because the bars are made of their own manipulated thoughts. Let us transition this understanding to the modern battlefield. We have moved from the era of the printing press to the era of the algorithm. We are currently engaged in what military strategists call fifth-generation warfare. In previous generations of warfare, the objectives were physical, capturing territory, destroying infrastructure, or defeating an enemy army. In fifth-generation warfare, the objective is entirely cognitive. The battlefield is the human mind. The goal is not to destroy the enemy's cities, but to destroy the enemy's will to fight, their trust in their own institutions, and their ability to agree on basic, objective facts. In this new paradigm, an operation like Mockingbird would not require the recruitment of hundreds of individual journalists. It would require the manipulation of a handful of social media algorithms. The intelligence agencies of today, both domestic and foreign, do not need to plant stories in the New York Times to reach you. They can target you directly. They can access massive databases of your online behavior, mapping your political leanings, your economic anxieties, and your deepest psychological vulnerabilities. Imagine a system that identifies a citizen who is deeply fearful of economic instability. An algorithm, perhaps designed by a hostile intelligence service or perhaps a domestic political operation, begins to subtly feed that citizen articles, videos, and social media posts that amplify that specific fear. The information might be gray propaganda, stories about factory closures and rising inflation, carefully curated to create a sense of impending doom. Then, the system introduces black propaganda, fabricated stories about a specific group of people who are supposedly causing this economic collapse. The citizen, already psychologically primed by the gray propaganda, readily accepts the black propaganda. Their fear is transmuted into directed anger. They have been weaponized, and they believe the entire process was the result of their own independent research. This is the decentralized Wurlitzer. It is automated, infinitely scalable, and operates with a precision that Frank Wisner could never have comprehended. We are no longer dealing with a broadcast model of manipulation, where one message is sent to millions. We are dealing with a hyper-personalized model of manipulation, where millions of distinct, tailored messages are sent to millions of individuals, locking each person in their own bespoke reality tunnel. The psychological toll of this constant, algorithmic manipulation is profound. We are seeing the fracturing of shared reality. When two citizens can look at the exact same event and perceive two entirely different, mutually exclusive realities, the foundation of democratic society begins to disintegrate. This is the ultimate blowback. The tools of cognitive manipulation that were designed to control foreign populations during the Cold War have been turned inward. The psychological warfare has become ambient. It is the air we breathe online. So, how does the individual defend against an adversary that operates within their own mind? How do you resist a manipulation that feels indistinguishable from your own thoughts? The first and most crucial step is the exact journey we have taken today. It is the acquisition of historical awareness. You must understand the architecture of the illusion. You must know that the system is not broken, it is functioning exactly as it was designed. The institutions that present themselves as objective arbiters of truth have a documented history of profound compromise. The second step is the cultivation of radical cognitive skepticism. You must train your mind to actively resist the emotional resonance of the information you consume. When an article or a video makes you feel sudden, intense anger, or profound, paralyzing fear, that is the exact moment your psychological defenses must engage. You must ask yourself, who benefits from me feeling this way? What action is this emotion designed to provoke? You must decouple your emotional response from your intellectual evaluation. The architects of Operation Mockingbird understood that human beings are fundamentally emotional creatures who rationalize their decisions after the fact. They exploited that vulnerability on a global scale. Your only defense is to reverse that process. You must lead with rational analysis, and suspect your own emotional reactions. You must become the auditor of your own mind. The history of the Central Intelligence Agency and the American media is not a story of the past. It is a prologue. The mechanisms of manipulation have evolved, the technology has advanced, but the fundamental objective remains identical, the complete subjugation of the human mind. The mighty Wurlitzer has not been dismantled. It has simply been upgraded. The music is still playing, louder and more complex than ever before. The only question that remains is whether you are going to continue dancing to their tune, or if you will finally have the terrifying courage to walk off the stage. The investigation into Mockingbird is not over. It is happening right now, inside your own head. Stay vigilant.